In this emotional story, we meet Elena, a 70-year-old woman facing a harsh reality. After being evicted from her home by a wealthy landlord, she struggles to survive on the streets. But when the landlord, Ricardo, sees her begging, something unexpected happens. He recognizes a necklace she's wearing, one that once belonged to his mother. This simple piece of jewelry stirs memories long buried, leading to a series of revelations that will change both of their lives forever. Their journey from pain to healing is one of resilience, forgiveness, and the rediscovery of love. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. The golden rays of the setting sun barely made their way through the faded curtains of Elena's modest apartment, casting a soft glow that did little to brighten the shadows of her life. At 70, every line etched into her weathered face bore witness to years of hardship, loss, and resilience. But on this particular day, the weight of those years felt almost unbearable, as if the very air had grown heavy with despair. A sharp knock on the door shattered the fragile peace, reverberating through the small room like the crack of a whip. Elena's frail hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob, her heart already sinking with dread. Standing in front of her was Ricardo, the landlord, his eyes cold and indifferent, his suit pristine and utterly out of place in the humble surroundings. "Mrs. Elena, you know why I've come," he said, his voice devoid of any trace of compassion. Elena nodded, her pulse quickening, her breath shallow with fear. "Please, Mr. Ricardo," she began, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. "Just a few more days. My pension. It's been delayed." Ricardo cut her off with a wave of his hand, his expression hardening. "We've been over this," he said flatly. "A month without rent is unacceptable. You have until tomorrow to leave. No exceptions." His words landed with the force of a sledgehammer, shattering the fragile hope Elena had clung to. She felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of this man who seemed to lack even a shred of humanity. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've called this place home for 15 years. I've never—" "Rules are rules," Ricardo replied coolly, glancing around the apartment as though it were beneath him. "Don't make this any harder than it has to be." And with that, he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in Elena's heart. As silence reclaimed the room, Elena crumpled into her threadbare armchair, the weight of despair pressing down on her like an iron fist. Her eyes, hollow with sorrow, fell upon an old photograph, a young boy, smiling, full of life. Her son, whom she had lost so long ago. With trembling fingers, she reached into a nearby drawer and retrieved the one thing she cherished above all else: a delicate necklace, the last tangible link to the child she had loved with all her heart. The necklace caught the fading light, its fragile beauty mocking the bleakness that now engulfed her world. Clutching it to her chest, Elena closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. The day she had been forced to make the most agonizing decision of her life. "I promise you," she whispered into the silence, her voice thick with grief, "I will never let this go. It's all I have left of you, my sweet boy." As the night crept in, she held onto the necklace as if it were the only thing keeping her from sinking into the abyss. As darkness blanketed the bustling city, Elena quietly packed her few remaining possessions, each item a symbol of a lifetime filled with both precious memories and deep heartache. Her modest apartment, once a sanctuary, now seemed foreign and empty. The necklace, her most cherished keepsake, rested close to her heart, its delicate chain a constant reminder of the profound loss she had endured and the unwavering strength she still needed to summon. Outside, the world carried on, oblivious to the quiet tragedy unfolding within those four walls. Cars hummed by, people hurried to their destinations, and life persisted without pause. But for Elena, time had ceased to exist, and the future that had always felt uncertain now loomed before her as a vast, terrifying void. Her mind drifted back 30 years to a different version of herself, a woman full of fierce determination and fragile hope. At 40, Elena had been a single mother navigating a harsh city, her spirit unbroken despite the relentless challenges that life threw her way. Her eyes, back then, sparkled with the resilience of a woman who believed in better days ahead. Every step she took was for her son, Ricardito, who at 10 years old was the very center of her universe, the reason she kept pushing forward. She would rise before the sun, her body aching from exhaustion, yet her heart filled with love and purpose. On that fateful morning, Elena prepared a simple breakfast for her beloved Ricardito, kissing his forehead tenderly as she dressed him for school. "Be good today, my darling," she whispered with a smile, masking her weariness. "Mom will be home soon." Her words were a promise to return, to provide, to protect. With one last glance at her precious boy, she stepped out into the early morning light, ready to face another grueling day. The textile factory, where she spent most of her hours, greeted her with its suffocating atmosphere. The air was thick with dust and the deafening roar of machinery. Elena worked with unwavering focus, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had long learned to silence her discomfort. She ignored the supervisor's leering gaze and the biting remarks from other workers, focusing instead on each peso she earned, each one a small step closer to a brighter future for her son. By noon, Elena rushed across town to clean houses in a wealthy neighborhood. Dona Mercedes, her employer, greeted her with the usual cold disdain. "Elena, there was dust on the shelf yesterday," she remarked, her voice dripping with condescension. "Today, I expect everything to be spotless, or I'll dock your pay." Swallowing her pride, Elena nodded silently, her hands already aching from the work still ahead. As she scrubbed floors and polished furniture, her thoughts drifted to Ricardito. Had he eaten enough at school? Was he staying warm? Was he keeping up with his studies? The constant worry gnawed at her, even as she forced herself to continue working, knowing she had no choice. When the afternoon arrived, Elena moved to the plaza, selling homemade empanadas under the blistering sun. Each smile she offered her customers masked the deep fatigue that weighed her down. But she kept going, counting every coin with care. Every sale was a small victory, a step closer to providing her son with more than just survival, a future where he could thrive. But the day felt endlessly long, and by the time Elena finally returned home, the sun had set, and exhaustion clung to her bones like a heavy shroud. Her apartment, usually filled with the lively chatter of her son, was eerily quiet. "Ricardito," she called softly, her heart sinking as the silence persisted. Panic gripped her as she found him lying in bed, his small body burning with fever. "Mom," he whispered weakly, his eyes glassy with pain. "I don't feel well." At that moment, fear overwhelmed her. Fear of losing the one person she had worked so tirelessly to protect. She had no money for medicine and no one to turn to for help. The crushing weight of helplessness settled over her as she sat beside her son, holding his hand and praying for strength she wasn't sure she had left. As Elena cradled Ricardito in her arms, the darkness of the night seemed to close in around her, pressing down with a suffocating weight. She knew of only one person who could provide the money she so desperately needed: Don Ramon, the neighborhood moneylender. His reputation was notorious, his deals as dangerous as the shadows that lurked in the alleyways. But Elena felt cornered with no other option. Her heart heavy with dread, she wrapped Ricardito tightly in a blanket and ventured out into the cold night. Each step she took was filled with anxiety, but the fierce love of a mother propelled her forward, making her willing to face the deepest fears for the sake of her child. The streets felt unusually quiet, the silence amplifying the sense of danger that hung in the air. Elena clutched the necklace around her neck, the last remnant of her mother, a symbol of the love and strength she had once known. "Give me strength," she whispered into the night, her voice trembling with fear and hope. She knew that what she was about to do could change the course of their lives forever, but desperation left her with no other choice. When she finally reached Don Ramon's shop, the stench of dampness and despair overwhelmed her senses. The dimly lit room seemed to reflect the hopelessness that so many others had experienced before her. With trembling steps, Elena entered, her heart pounding as she held the necklace tightly in her hand, a talisman against the dangers that lay ahead. Don Ramon greeted her with a smile that never touched his eyes, a predatory grin that sent a chill down her spine. "What brings you here, Elena?" he asked, his voice smooth and sweet, but with an undertone of menace that made her shudder. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out of her dry throat. "I need money. For medicine. My son is sick." Don Ramon's gaze lingered on her, his eyes drifting down to the necklace around her neck. "That necklace," he said slowly, "would make a fine deposit." Elena's heart tightened. "No," she replied, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Not the necklace. I'll work extra hours, do whatever is necessary, but not this." She held onto it as if it were the only piece of her mother she had left. After what felt like an eternity of tense negotiation, Don Ramon agreed to give her the money, but the cost was heavy. As Elena left the shop, the weight of the debt pressed down on her shoulders, almost as heavy as the worry for her son. She rushed to the pharmacy, arriving just as it was about to close. Breathless and shaking, she bought the medicine, her hands fumbling as she counted out the precious coins. She ran all the way home, her mind filled with fear and hope. When she finally arrived, Ricardito was still restless, his small body burning with fever. Elena carefully administered the medicine, her fingers gently stroking his damp forehead as she whispered words of comfort. "You'll be okay, my love. You have to be," she said, more to convince herself than her ailing son. The next morning, after a sleepless night filled with worry, Elena dragged herself to the factory, dark circles prominent under her eyes. Her exhaustion was palpable, but she had no choice. She needed to keep working, to keep earning, to pay off the debt, and to ensure her son's future. But as soon as she arrived, Don Carlos, the factory supervisor, intercepted her in a deserted hallway. "Elena," he called out, his voice slick with false concern. He stepped too close, his eyes leering. "You look tired. Why don't you come to my office? We could discuss a raise, if you're willing to be flexible." Elena recoiled, her stomach churning with disgust. "No, thank you, Don Carlos," she replied quickly, stepping back to put distance between them. "I'm fine as I am." His expression darkened, his eyes narrowing with displeasure. "Think about it," he said, his voice now laced with a warning. "It would be a shame if we had to let you go." The threat lingered in the air like a poison. Elena spent the rest of the day avoiding his gaze, the fear of losing her job mingling with the constant worry for Ricardito. During her break, Elena pulled out the necklace once more, gazing at it with a mix of sorrow and determination. Memories of her mother flooded her mind, memories of a woman who had faced adversity with grace and dignity. Those memories gave her strength, reminding her that she, too, could endure. When she returned home that evening, she found Ricardito feeling a little better but still weak. "Mom," he asked innocently, his small voice cutting through her exhaustion, "why do you work so much?" Elena hugged him tightly, her heart aching with both love and guilt. "So you can have a better future, my darling," she whispered, holding back tears. That night, as Ricardito slept peacefully for the first time in days, Elena sat by his bedside, staring at the few coins she had left and feeling the crushing weight of the debt she owed to Don Ramon. The thought of selling the necklace crossed her mind more than once, but each time, the memory of her mother stopped her. "I promised you, Mom," she whispered to the necklace, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "I'll keep fighting. For Ricardito, for you and myself." Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware of the turmoil unfolding within that small apartment. Elena lay down beside her son, exhausted but resolute, knowing that tomorrow would bring another battle, another day of sacrifice. But as long as there was even a glimmer of hope, she would keep going. For Ricardito, for the future they both deserved. The days blurred into weeks, and Elena's life became a relentless race against time. Each morning, she rose before dawn, her body aching with exhaustion, but her mind focused on one thing: survival. Ricardito was her anchor, the reason she endured the factory's suffocating atmosphere, Don Carlos's threatening stares, and the endless demands of her employers. Every peso she earned brought her closer to paying off the debt, but the weight of it never seemed to lighten. One afternoon, while scrubbing the floors of Dona Mercedes's opulent home, Elena overheard a conversation that sent a chill down her spine. "Did you hear about the raid in the neighborhood?" Dona Mercedes asked a friend, her voice casual despite the gravity of her words. "They say the government is taking children of single mothers to orphanages. It's for their good." Elena's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. The mere thought of losing Ricardito was unbearable, a fear more paralyzing than anything she had ever faced. That night, she held her son tighter than ever, her arms wrapped around him as though she could shield him from the cruel world outside. "I will protect you," she vowed silently, her heart swelling with both love and fear. "No matter what it takes, I will keep you safe." And with that promise, she steeled herself for the battles yet to come. As the weeks passed, Elena's burden grew heavier. The debt she owed to Don Ramon loomed over her like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every aspect of her life. The moneylender, losing patience, began sending his men to her door. They were ruthless, intimidating figures who carried an air of menace wherever they went. "Remember, Elena?" one of them hissed during one of their visits, his voice dripping with malice. "Don Ramon always collects his debts, one way or another." His words sent a chill through her, fear gripping her heart tighter with each passing day. Desperation gnawed at her soul. Her income from the factory and her cleaning jobs wasn't enough to keep up with the mounting interest on her debt. She knew she had to do something more, something drastic. That's when she made the difficult decision to take on a night job at a bar. The work was grueling, the hours long, and the customers were often disrespectful, their lewd comments and unwanted advances adding another layer of hardship to her already unbearable life. But each small tip she earned brought her a step closer to paying off the debt that had become a noose around her neck. One evening, after another exhausting shift, Elena dragged herself home, her body aching and her spirit drained. But as she approached her building, she was greeted by a sight that stopped her in her tracks. There, sitting on the cold, hard steps was Ricardito, his small figure hunched over as he tried to sell gum to the passers-by. The sight of her precious boy, struggling to help her in his innocent way, shattered her already fragile heart. "What are you doing out here, my love?" Elena asked, her voice trembling with a mix of surprise and horror. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she reached out to hold him close. Ricardito looked up at her, his big, innocent eyes filled with determination far beyond his years. "I want to help you, Mom," he said earnestly, his voice filled with a sense of responsibility no child should ever feel. "I know you work hard for me, and I want to do my part." Elena couldn't hold back the tears that had been threatening to spill over for days. She pulled her son into a tight embrace, her sobs racking her tired body. The guilt she felt was overwhelming. What kind of life was she providing for her little boy? A life filled with struggle, fear, and uncertainty. She had tried so hard to shield him from the harsh realities of their existence. But now, it seemed, even Ricardito could see the cracks in the fragile world she had built around them. That night, after Ricardito had finally drifted off to sleep, Elena found herself sitting alone at the small table in their kitchen. The weight of her despair pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. With trembling hands, she reached for the necklace she always wore, the one her mother had given her so many years ago. She held it up to the faint moonlight streaming through the window, watching as the delicate gem seemed to shimmer with the memories of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. A life filled with hope, with dreams, with the possibility of a brighter future. "What should I do, Mom?" Elena whispered into the silence, as if the necklace could somehow offer her the guidance she so desperately needed. Tears slid down her cheeks as she cradled the delicate chain in her hands, her mind racing with thoughts of Ricardito and the impossible choices that lay before her. And then, in that moment of unbearable anguish, she made a decision that tore her heart in two. With shaking hands, Elena rifled through a drawer filled with old papers until she found what she was looking for. A card from an adoption agency that had been given to her years ago, when times were tough and hope seemed distant. She stared at the card for a long time, her vision blurred by tears. The thought of giving up her son was like a knife twisting in her chest, but deep down, she wondered if it was the only way to give him a chance at a better life. "Forgive me, my sweet boy," Elena whispered brokenly as she gazed at Ricardito's peaceful face, the sight of him sleeping so innocently making her heart ache. "Maybe this is the only way to give you the life you deserve." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but she knew that sometimes love meant making sacrifices that no mother should ever have to make. When morning came, it arrived with a heaviness that Elena had never felt before. Every step, every breath seemed to carry the weight of the impossible choice she was about to make. Ricardito, blissfully unaware of the storm raging in his mother's heart, sat at the table eating breakfast with his usual cheerfulness. He chattered on about his plans for the day at school, his excitement spilling over as he talked about a project he was working on. Elena watched him with tear-filled eyes, committing every detail to memory. The way his tousled hair fell over his forehead, the smudge of milk at the corner of his mouth, the way his eyes sparkled with the innocent joy of childhood. Each smile and each laugh felt like a dagger plunging deeper into her already broken heart. As Ricardito prattled on, Elena silently prayed for strength, for the courage to do what she thought was right, even if it meant losing the most precious thing in her life. But in the depths of her soul, she knew that no matter what decision she made, it would never stop hurting. "Ricardito, my love," Elena began, her voice trembling as she tried to maintain control over the torrent of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "You won't be going to school today. We're going somewhere special." She forced a smile, though it felt like a fragile mask barely concealing the storm raging inside her. Ricardito, ever the curious and innocent boy, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Where are we going, Mom?" he asked eagerly, his small face lighting up with anticipation. "It's a surprise," she replied softly, desperately hoping her forced cheerfulness would convince him that everything was okay. As they made their way through the crowded streets, Elena's heart grew heavier with each step. It felt as though the ground beneath her feet was crumbling, leading her toward a precipice she couldn't avoid. Ricardito, blissfully unaware of the gravity of their destination, skipped beside her, his laughter echoing like a cruel reminder of the innocence she was about to shatter. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, determined to keep moving forward despite the unbearable weight of the decision she was about to make. When they finally reached the adoption agency, Elena's legs suddenly felt like lead. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, as she stared at the building that would change both of their lives forever. Ricardito tugged gently at her hand, his carefree smile fading as he looked up at her with concern. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked in that sweet, gentle voice that always melted her heart. "Why are you crying?" Elena knelt in front of him, her hands shaking as she cupped his small face. She gazed into his innocent eyes, trying to memorize every detail of his features. Features that she loved more than anything in this world. "My boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My precious boy, I need you to know something. I love you more than anything, more than you could ever imagine." Tears streamed down her face, and Ricardito, though confused, wrapped his little arms around her, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. "I love you too, Mom," he said softly, his words both a balm and a dagger to her heart. At that moment, a woman from the agency appeared, her professional demeanor faltering when she saw the anguish written all over Elena's face. The woman hesitated for a moment, then asked gently, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Her voice was low, laced with sympathy, as she looked between Elena and Ricardito. Elena looked at her son again, her heart breaking into a million pieces. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around, to run away with him, and never look back. But reality held her in place, reminding her of the crushing debt, the nights spent working until she could barely stand, the threats that loomed over their fragile existence. She knew this was the hardest thing she would ever do, but she also believed it was the only way to give him a chance at a better life. With a tear-filled nod, she made the impossible choice. "Ricardito," she said, her voice trembling as she forced herself to speak. "You're going to stay here for a little while. These people are going to take good care of you." Her words were hollow, spoken through the thick haze of grief that clouded her mind. Ricardito's expression shifted, fear creeping into his innocent eyes as he looked from his mother to the unfamiliar building. "But what about you, Mom?" he asked, his small voice trembling with uncertainty. Elena's heart shattered into pieces. She wanted to hold him, to promise that she would never leave him, but all she could do was force herself to lie. I'll come back for you, my love," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her sorrow. "I promise." She kissed his forehead, her tears falling onto his soft hair as she tried to believe in the words she spoke. But deep down, she knew that promise was one she might never be able to keep. The woman from the agency gently took Ricardito's hand, leading him away. Elena stood frozen, her body numb with pain as she watched her son disappear through the doors. A piece of her soul was being ripped away, and she felt as though she were dying inside. As a final act of love, she reached into her pocket and took out the necklace, her last treasure, the one thing that connected her to her past and her mother. With trembling hands, she tucked it into Ricardito's small backpack, whispering, "So you'll always have me close." Her words were barely audible, a soft prayer to the universe, though she knew Ricardito could no longer hear her. Elena stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as the doors closed with a finality that crushed her spirit. The world around her seemed to fade away, and all she could do was stare at the place where she had last seen her son, the very heart of her existence. In that moment, she felt as though she had lost everything. Her reason for living, her hope for the future, her very soul. And as the city continued to buzz with life around her, Elena remained motionless, consumed by grief so deep that it seemed to swallow her whole. The tears Elena had fought so desperately to contain finally broke free, flowing down her weathered cheeks in torrents. She collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving sidewalk, sobbing uncontrollably, her entire body trembling with the weight of her sorrow. The world around her blurred as passers-by hurried by, casting curious glances but offering no comfort. At that moment, nothing mattered, no dignity, no shame, only the unbearable ache of losing her son. Her heart shattered into pieces, and with each sob, she released the pain she had carried for so long. But even in her despair, a spark of determination ignited within her. Elena swore to herself, right then and there, that she would do everything in her power to reunite with Ricardito one day. No matter how long it took, no matter how impossible it seemed, she would find a way. If it took a lifetime, so be it. She would not rest until she held her son in her arms again. The years that followed were a relentless battle against time and circumstance. Every day without Ricardito was a fresh wound, a scar that refused to heal. Elena threw herself into her work, taking on every job she could find, from scrubbing floors to washing dishes, from dawn until dusk. She lived frugally, saving every penny she earned in the hopes that one day she could offer her son the life he deserved, the life she had always dreamed of giving him. But with each passing day, the weight of her loss grew heavier, and the distance between them seemed insurmountable. One gray, dreary afternoon, while cleaning a wealthy family's home, Elena stumbled upon a photograph that nearly took her breath away. Her heart pounded in her chest as she held the image in her trembling hands. It was a portrait of a smiling teenage boy, standing beside his adoptive parents, his face beaming with joy. Though the years had transformed him from the little boy she once knew, Elena recognized those eyes. Those same, familiar eyes that had once looked up at her with love and trust. It was her Ricardito. With trembling hands, she turned the photograph over and read the inscription on the back. Ricardo Montero, 15 years old. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. After all the years of wondering, of aching, of not knowing if he was safe or even alive, here was a clue, something tangible. Her son was out there, living a life she could only imagine, a life far removed from the one she had once shared with him. That night, in the solitude of her small rented room, Elena cried tears of both joy and sorrow. Her boy, her precious Ricardito, was alive, and from the looks of it, he was happy. But the realization that he was so far away from her, both in distance and in the life he now led, was almost too much to bear. She ached to run to him, to hold him, to tell him how much she had missed him every single day. But she also feared what that would mean. What if her presence disrupted the life he had built with his new family? What if seeing her only brought him pain? The days that followed were pure agony. Elena's heart was torn in two, between the overwhelming desire to reunite with her son and the fear of disrupting the happiness he had found. She couldn't stop herself from seeking out more information, discreetly gathering details about the Montero family. They were wealthy and powerful, owners of numerous properties and businesses throughout the city. Ricardo had grown up in a world far removed from the one she had known, a world of privilege and opportunity. One afternoon, unable to resist the pull any longer, Elena ventured to the affluent neighborhood where the Monteros lived. She stood outside the gates of their grand mansion, her heart pounding as she imagined the life of luxury her son now led. The house was imposing, a symbol of wealth and power, and Elena felt small and insignificant in its shadow. Just as she was about to leave, telling herself that she didn't belong there, the front door opened, and a young man stepped out. Elena's heart stopped as she saw him. Her son, now a man, tall and confident, with the bearing of someone who had everything the world could offer. She stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, as she watched him walk toward the gate. For a brief, electrifying moment, their eyes met. Elena held her breath, every fiber of her being yearning for recognition. But Ricardo simply glanced at her, his expression indifferent, and walked past her without a second thought. He didn't recognize her. The boy she had loved with all her heart, the boy she had sacrificed everything for, was now a stranger to her. Elena stood there, numb, as Ricardo disappeared down the street. The pain in her heart was indescribable, an ache so deep that it felt as if her very soul had been torn in two. She had found her son, but he was no longer the child she had known. As she stood there, tears streaming down her face, Elena realized that the journey to reunite with Ricardito would be far more difficult than she had ever imagined. But despite the pain, despite the overwhelming sense of loss, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never give up on him. No matter how long it took, she would find a way to bring her son back into her life. That night, Elena sat in her dimly lit room, holding a worn photograph of Ricardito when he was still a child. A boy full of hope and love, with eyes that radiated innocence. She couldn't stop herself from mentally comparing that image to the young man she had seen earlier that day. They were the same person, yet they seemed like two different souls separated by time and circumstance. Elena's heart ached as she stared at the photo, her tears blurring the lines of her past and present. "Did I do the right thing?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with doubt. The question gnawed at her, refusing to leave her mind. Should she reveal herself to him after all these years? Did she have the right to disrupt the life he had built without her, the life she had sacrificed so much to protect? As the hours of the night dragged on, Elena lay wide awake, her thoughts a tangled web of love, guilt, and fear. She was torn between a mother's deep, unyielding love and the overwhelming terror of shattering the peace her son seemed to have found. What if seeing her again would only confuse him or worse, cause him pain? What if her presence would ruin everything he had worked so hard for? She could barely breathe under the weight of these questions. At that moment, nothing mattered, no dignity, no shame, only the unbearable ache of losing her son. Her heart shattered into pieces, and with each sob, she released the pain she had carried for so long. But even in her despair, a spark of determination ignited within her. Elena swore to herself, right then and there, that she would do everything in her power to reunite with Ricardito one day. No matter how long it took, no matter how impossible it seemed, she would find a way. If it took a lifetime, so be it. She would not rest until she held her son in her arms again. The years that followed were a relentless battle against time and circumstance. Every day without Ricardito was a fresh wound, a scar that refused to heal. Elena threw herself into her work, taking on every job she could find, from scrubbing floors to washing dishes, from dawn until dusk. She lived frugally, saving every penny she earned in the hopes that one day she could offer her son the life he deserved, the life she had always dreamed of giving him. But with each passing day, the weight of her loss grew heavier, and the distance between them seemed insurmountable. One gray, dreary afternoon, while cleaning a wealthy family's home, Elena stumbled upon a photograph that nearly took her breath away. Her heart pounded in her chest as she held the image in her trembling hands. It was a portrait of a smiling teenage boy, standing beside his adoptive parents, his face beaming with joy. Though the years had transformed him from the little boy she once knew, Elena recognized those eyes. Those same, familiar eyes that had once looked up at her with love and trust. It was her Ricardito. With trembling hands, she turned the photograph over and read the inscription on the back. Ricardo Montero, 15 years old. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. After all the years of wondering, of aching, of not knowing if he was safe or even alive, here was a clue, something tangible. Her son was out there, living a life she could only imagine, a life far removed from the one she had once shared with him. That night, in the solitude of her small rented room, Elena cried tears of both joy and sorrow. Her boy, her precious Ricardito, was alive, and from the looks of it, he was happy. But the realization that he was so far away from her, both in distance and in the life he now led, was almost too much to bear. She ached to run to him, to hold him, to tell him how much she had missed him every single day. But she also feared what that would mean. What if her presence disrupted the life he had built with his new family? What if seeing her only brought him pain? The days that followed were pure agony. Elena's heart was torn in two, between the overwhelming desire to reunite with her son and the fear of disrupting the happiness he had found. She couldn't stop herself from seeking out more information, discreetly gathering details about the Montero family. They were wealthy and powerful, owners of numerous properties and businesses throughout the city. Ricardo had grown up in a world far removed from the one she had known, a world of privilege and opportunity. One afternoon, unable to resist the pull any longer, Elena ventured to the affluent neighborhood where the Monteros lived. She stood outside the gates of their grand mansion, her heart pounding as she imagined the life of luxury her son now led. The house was imposing, a symbol of wealth and power, and Elena felt small and insignificant in its shadow. Just as she was about to leave, telling herself that she didn't belong there, the front door opened, and a young man stepped out. Elena's heart stopped as she saw him. Her son, now a man, tall and confident, with the bearing of someone who had everything the world could offer. She stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, as she watched him walk toward the gate. For a brief, electrifying moment, their eyes met. Elena held her breath, every fiber of her being yearning for recognition. But Ricardo simply glanced at her, his expression indifferent, and walked past her without a second thought. He didn't recognize her. The boy she had loved with all her heart, the boy she had sacrificed everything for, was now a stranger to her. Elena stood there, numb, as Ricardo disappeared down the street. The pain in her heart was indescribable, an ache so deep that it felt as if her very soul had been torn in two. She had found her son, but he was no longer the child she had known. As she stood there, tears streaming down her face, Elena realized that the journey to reunite with Ricardito would be far more difficult than she had ever imagined. But despite the pain, despite the overwhelming sense of loss, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never give up on him. No matter how long it took, she would find a way to bring her son back into her life. That night, Elena sat in her dimly lit room, holding a worn photograph of Ricardito when he was still a child. A boy full of hope and love, with eyes that radiated innocence. She couldn't stop herself from mentally comparing that image to the young man she had seen earlier that day. They were the same person, yet they seemed like two different souls separated by time and circumstance. Elena's heart ached as she stared at the photo, her tears blurring the lines of her past and present. "Did I do the right thing?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with doubt. The question gnawed at her, refusing to leave her mind. Should she reveal herself to him after all these years? Did she have the right to disrupt the life he had built without her, the life she had sacrificed so much to protect? As the hours of the night dragged on, Elena lay wide awake, her thoughts a tangled web of love, guilt, and fear. She was torn between a mother's deep, unyielding love and the overwhelming terror of shattering the peace her son seemed to have found. What if seeing her again would only confuse him or worse, cause him pain? What if her presence would ruin everything he had worked so hard for? She could barely breathe under the weight of these questions. But as the early morning light crept through her window, Elena made a decision. Her heart broke a little more as she resolved not to reveal herself to Ricardo. She would stay in the shadows, close enough to watch over him, but far enough away not to interfere with his life. "I promise you, my boy," she whispered to the photograph, her voice barely audible through her tears. "Even if you don't know me, I'll always be watching over you. Always." With that vow, Elena began to quietly plan how she could remain a part of Ricardo's world without him ever knowing. It would be the most bittersweet of roles, being there for him in silence, hiding her love and identity as a precious but painful secret. But it was the only way she could stay close to him, even if it meant she could never truly hold him again. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years, Elena became an almost invisible presence in the world of the Monteros. Her once dark hair had turned silver with age, and her hands were rough and calloused from decades of hard work. She managed to find a job as a gardener at a nearby property, which allowed her to be near Ricardo without ever crossing the boundaries she had set for herself. Each morning, as she tended to the garden's roses, she watched her son from afar. She would see him drive away in his sleek, luxurious car, always dressed in the finest suits, his shoulders squared with the confidence of a man who had the world at his feet. Elena's heart swelled with both pride and sorrow. Pride in the man her son had become, and sorrow for the distance that still separated them. She longed to reach out, to tell him how much she loved him, but she held herself back, honoring the promise she had made to herself that night long ago. One day, while Elena was trimming the rose bushes, she overheard a heated argument coming from the garden of the neighboring mansion. She paused, her heart quickening when she recognized Ricardo's voice. He was arguing with his adoptive father, Mr. Montero. The tension in the air was palpable, and Elena couldn't help but listen as the argument unfolded. "You can't keep going like this, Ricardo." Mr. Montero's voice was harsh, filled with frustration and anger. "Your decisions are ruining the company. Don't you care about this family's legacy?" Ricardo's voice, normally so composed, was filled with bitterness. "Legacy?" he spat out, his words sharp and cutting. "All you've ever taught me is how to be cruel and greedy. Is that the legacy you want me to continue?" Elena's heart sank as she listened to the painful exchange. The child she had once known, so full of love and innocence, was now a man struggling under the weight of expectations and bitterness. She could hear the hurt in his voice, the conflict that tore at him. For all his outward success, her son was burdened by something deeper, something that no amount of wealth or power could fix. At that moment, Elena realized that despite the life of luxury Ricardo had been given, he was not truly happy. He was fighting battles of his own, battles she had never imagined. The thought that her son might be suffering in ways she couldn't understand filled her with a new kind of pain, one that threatened to unravel the careful balance she had maintained for so long. Elena's hands trembled as she resumed her work, her mind racing. She had stayed in the shadows, believing it was the best way to protect him. But now, she wondered if perhaps her presence, her love, might be what he truly needed. The thought terrified her, but it also planted a seed of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be more than a silent guardian in his life. Elena stood frozen behind the bush, her heart pounding in her chest, as she listened to the argument unfolding between Ricardo and his adoptive father. The sharp words exchanged revealed a side of her son she had never imagined. The sweet, innocent Ricardito she had once cradled in her arms had transformed into a man driven by cold ambition and a ruthless hunger for power. His voice, once filled with love and laughter, now carried a harshness that broke Elena's heart. That night, as she sat alone in the quiet of her small, dimly lit room, the weight of her choices crushed her spirit. She cried bitterly, her tears flowing like rivers of regret. Had her decision to give him up for adoption all those years ago turned him into this hardened man? Had she lost her son to the very world she had hoped would give him a better life? The days that followed were pure torture for Elena. Every time she saw Ricardo, her heart ached as she desperately searched his face, his eyes, for some sign of the boy she had known and loved. But all she saw was coldness, a steely determination that seemed to have eclipsed the warmth of his childhood. He moved through life like a man possessed, consumed by his pursuit of wealth and status. And each time Elena saw him, it felt as though the distance between them grew wider, the boy she had known slipping further and further away. One afternoon, as Ricardo inspected the property with his usual detached air, Elena could no longer contain herself. She watched him walk by without even glancing in her direction, and something inside her broke. Summoning every ounce of courage, she spoke up, her voice trembling with both fear and love. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her words hanging in the air like fragile whispers. Ricardo stopped in his tracks and turned to look at her, his expression one of indifference. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cool and detached as if she were nothing more than an insignificant presence. Elena swallowed hard, her heart racing. I just wanted to say that life is more than money and power," she said, her voice faltering but filled with sincerity. "Sometimes love and compassion are more valuable than any fortune." For a brief moment, something flickered in Ricardo's eyes. A softness, a glimmer of the boy she had once known. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He straightened, his expression hardening once again. "Save your advice, woman," he replied coldly. "You know nothing about my life." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing there, her heart shattered once more. As she watched him disappear into the distance, tears welled up in her eyes. How could she reach him? How could she show him the path of love and compassion that she had always wanted for him? The pain of watching her son drift further away from the person she had hoped he would become was almost unbearable. But Elena knew that she couldn't give up. No matter how long it took, she would find a way to remind Ricardo of who he truly was, even if it meant revealing the truth she had kept hidden for so many years. Autumn arrived in the city, painting the landscape in vibrant hues of gold and red. The air grew colder, and the trees shed their leaves, creating a blanket of color across the gardens. Elena, now growing older and increasingly weary, continued her work near the Montero mansion, sweeping away the fallen leaves and tending to the plants with the same quiet dedication she had always shown. But inside, her heart was in turmoil. The desire to approach Ricardo, to finally reveal the truth, gnawed at her every day. Yet the fear of the consequences, of how her son might react, of what it could mean for his life, held her back. She was torn between two equally powerful forces, her love for him and the terror of losing him again. One cold morning, as Elena swept the leaves from the garden, she noticed an elegant woman approaching the mansion. It was Sofia, Ricardo's wife. Elena had seen her before, but something about this moment felt different. Sofia's normally composed face was marked by tension, and there was a distant look in her eyes, as though she were searching for something beyond the luxury and comfort of her home. Elena watched her carefully, her curiosity piqued. Sofia paused for a moment, standing still in the garden, her gaze drifting across the landscape. For an instant, her eyes met Elena's, and there was something in that glance, an unspoken connection, a fleeting sense of recognition, as though Sofia could see the depth of Elena's pain and longing. It seemed like she was about to speak, as if she, too, had something weighing on her heart. But just as quickly, the moment passed. Sofia broke the gaze and continued on her way, disappearing into the mansion. Elena stood there for a long time, the broom still in her hand, lost in thought. What was it that Sophia had seen in her eyes? And what was it that Sophia herself was searching for? The questions lingered in Elena's mind as she resumed her work, but they also planted a seed of hope. Perhaps, in some way, Sophia could be the key to reconnecting with Ricardo. Perhaps, through her, Elena could find a way to reach the heart of her son and show him the love she had never stopped feeling. Elena's unease gnawed at her after the encounter with Sophia in the garden. Something about the tension in the young woman's voice, the sadness in her eyes, had lingered in Elena's mind. Days later, as she tended to the roses, Elena overheard another conversation between Ricardo and Sophia, their voices drifting from the garden to her hiding place among the bushes. "You can't go on like this," Sophia's voice trembled with concern, echoing the worry that had etched itself into her features. "You're pushing away everyone who loves you. What happened to the man I fell in love with?" Ricardo's response was cold, almost mechanical. "That man was weak," he replied flatly. "The business world doesn't forgive weakness." Sophia's words grew more urgent. "But at what cost, Ricardo? You're losing your humanity. Is this the life you want?" Elena's heart clenched painfully as she listened. The gentle, loving boy she had once known was buried beneath layers of bitterness and ambition. How had her sweet Ricardito turned into this distant man, consumed by power and detached from the warmth of human connection? That night, as she lay in her small bed, sleep refused to come. Her mind was consumed with memories of her son, the bright-eyed child who had once filled her life with joy. The image of Ricardo, now so far removed from that little boy, haunted her. Unable to bear the ache in her chest, Elena reached for the old photo album she kept hidden beneath her pillow, the one treasure she had never parted with. She carefully turned the pages, her trembling fingers tracing the photographs of a smiling Ricardito, his face full of innocence and happiness. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at the images, longing for the past and the connection they had once shared. How could she make him remember who he truly was? In a moment of clarity, Elena knew she had to do something. She could no longer stand by and watch her son be consumed by the coldness of the world he had chosen. With trembling hands, she sat down at her small table and began to write. Each word was a plea from the depths of her heart. She wrote the story of a mother who had been forced to give up her son for adoption, a mother who had made the hardest decision of her life in the hopes of giving him a better future. She wrote about the love that had never faded, the longing that had never left her, and the hope that one day they would be reunited. Every word was a prayer, a wish that her son would find his way back to the warmth and compassion she had always dreamed for him. The next morning, with her heart pounding in her chest, Elena carefully folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. She walked to the Montero mansion, her hands shaking as she slipped the letter into the mailbox. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering if she was making a mistake. But the thought of her son lost in a world of cold ambition pushed her forward. She had to take this risk. She had to reach out no matter the cost. As she turned to walk away, Elena glanced up at the mansion's windows. For just an instant, she thought she saw Ricardo standing there, his gaze fixed on the street below. His expression was inscrutable, but something in his posture made her heart race. Could he feel the connection that still tied them together, even after all these years? Elena returned to her small room, her heart filled with a mix of hope and fear. She had done all she could. Now all that was left was to wait, and to trust that a mother's love, no matter how long it had been hidden, could find its way to her son's heart. She prayed that the words she had written would touch him, that they would remind him of the warmth and love that had once been a part of his life. The days that followed were agonizing for Elena. Every noise, every footstep outside her door, made her heart leap in her chest. She listened for any sign that her letter had been received, that her son might be reaching back out to her. But the world seemed indifferent to her prayers. Life at the Montero mansion carried on as usual, and Elena's hope began to wither with each passing day. Had her words been lost? Had her letter gone unread? A week later, while Elena was quietly working in the garden, she noticed something different. Ricardo emerged from the house as he always did, but this time, instead of heading straight for his car with his usual brisk pace, he stopped. His eyes scanned the garden, and for the briefest moment, they settled on Elena. Her breath caught in her throat. For an instant, it seemed as though he was about to say something. His gaze lingered, and the air felt thick with unspoken words. But then, just as quickly, he shook his head, as if dispelling whatever thought had crossed his mind, and continued on his way. Elena watched him leave, her heart aching with both hope and despair. She had seen something in his eyes, something that wasn't there before. A flicker of recognition, a moment of hesitation. But was it enough? Could her letter have reached him, even if he couldn't yet bring himself to acknowledge it? As Ricardo disappeared into the distance, Elena wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered a silent prayer. She wouldn't give up. She couldn't. Somehow, she would find a way to break through the walls that had built up around her son's heart. That afternoon, as Elena silently pruned the roses, she noticed Sofia approaching from the mansion. There was a mixture of curiosity and caution in her expression, as though she were grappling with something difficult. Elena's heart began to race as Sofia drew nearer. "Excuse me," Sofia said, her voice soft but steady. "You've been working here for a long time, haven't you?" Elena nodded, trying to keep her composure despite the anxiety welling up inside her. "Yes, ma'am, many years." Sofia hesitated, glancing around the garden before finally asking the question that seemed to weigh heavily on her mind. "By any chance, did you leave a letter in our mailbox last week?" Time seemed to stand still for Elena. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this moment had come. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was me." Sophia's eyes softened with a mixture of compassion and something else. Understanding, perhaps. "Is it true?" she asked gently. "Are you Elena?" Elena could no longer hold back the tears that had been threatening to spill over. She nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes," she admitted, her words barely audible. "I'm Ricardo's mother. I gave him up for adoption so many years ago." Sophia looked at her with a blend of sympathy and confusion. "Ricardo read your letter," she said quietly. "He's been different since then. More thoughtful, more human." A ray of hope pierced through Elena's heart, lifting her spirits. "He knows I'm here?" she asked, her voice tinged with both fear and anticipation. Sophia shook her head gently. "Not yet," she replied. "He's struggling with his feelings. He hasn't spoken much about it, but I can tell he's grappling with something. I think he needs to know the full truth, Elena." Just then, the sound of a car approaching broke the quiet moment. Both women turned to see Ricardo pulling into the driveway, returning home earlier than expected. Panic surged through Elena's chest as she looked back at Sofia. "Please," Elena begged, her voice filled with desperation. "Don't tell him you saw me. I need to be the one to talk to him." Sofia's expression softened even further, and she nodded in understanding. "I won't say anything," she promised, "but don't wait too long. Ricardo needs answers, and he needs them soon." As Sofia walked away, Elena remained rooted in place, trembling. She watched as Ricardo entered the house, and for a brief moment, their eyes met through the window. Elena's heart skipped a beat. There was something different in his gaze, something that made her feel as though, for the first time in years, he truly saw her. That night, in the solitude of her small room, Elena made a decision. Tomorrow would be the day. No matter what happened, no matter the consequences, she would reveal the truth to Ricardo. She could no longer bear the distance between them, the silence that had kept them apart for so long. With her heart filled with both fear and hope, she spent the night preparing herself for the moment that would change everything. The morning dawned with a palpable tension in the air. Elena dressed carefully, choosing her best blouse, the one she kept for special occasions. Her hands shook as she combed her hair, trying to calm her nerves. She had waited decades for this moment, and now that it was finally here, the weight of it threatened to overwhelm her. She arrived early in the garden, her heart pounding as she waited. The hours dragged by, each one filled with anticipation and fear. Every sound, every movement around her made her jump, but she held her ground. Finally, just before noon, she saw Ricardo emerge from the house, his usual air of confidence and distance still intact. But today, Elena knew everything would change. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Elena stepped forward. "Mr. Ricardo," she called softly, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Ricardo stopped, turning to face her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. His usual cold demeanor seemed to soften just a fraction as he looked at her. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's about the letter you received last week," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ricardo's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. "You?" he began, but his voice trailed off as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Yes," Elena confirmed, her words filled with emotion. "I wrote that letter. Ricardo, Ricardito, I'm your mother." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Ricardo stared at her, his face a storm of emotions. Disbelief, confusion, anger, and something deeper, something that looked like fear. "No," he said finally, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "This can't be true." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to explain. "The Monteros adopted you when you were 10 years old," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I had to give you up for adoption. I was young, poor. I couldn't give you the life you deserved." Ricardo took a step back as if her words had struck him physically. The pain in his eyes was undeniable, and Elena's heart broke to see it. "Why now?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and sorrow. "Why are you telling me this now?" Elena reached out, her hand trembling, but she stopped short of touching him. "I've been close all this time," she said softly, her voice full of regret. "I've watched over you from afar, hoping you were happy. But when I saw what you were becoming, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I needed to remind you of the love and compassion that still exist in this world." Ricardo's face twisted with conflicting emotions, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might break. He looked at Elena, his eyes filled with questions and pain, as if he didn't know what to do with the truth that had just been revealed to him. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "I don't know how to feel about this." Elena's tears flowed freely now, but there was a sense of peace in her heart. She had done what she needed to do. "You don't have to say anything right now," she said gently. "Just know that I love you. I've always loved you, and I'm here whenever you're ready." Ricardo stood there, silent and lost in thought, as the weight of the revelation settled over him. Elena didn't push him for more. She had planted the seed, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with it. As she turned to walk away, she whispered a final prayer in her heart, hoping that someday, the love that had always been between them would find its way back into the light. Ricardo's face hardened into a mask of steely resolve, his eyes narrowing as he confronted Elena. "What am I becoming?" he spat out, his voice crackling with raw intensity. "What could you possibly understand about me and my journey?" Elena's response came as a soft, almost mournful whisper, imbued with a depth of emotion that contrasted starkly with Ricardo's harshness. "I know you are far from happy," she replied with gentle sorrow. "I see within you a flicker of the goodness that once defined you, the pure-hearted boy you were before the world's harsh realities began to erode your spirit." Ricardo's piercing gaze held Elena captive, his expression a tumultuous sea of conflicting emotions. For a fleeting moment, it seemed he might open up further, revealing the turmoil that churned beneath his stoic facade. But instead, with an abruptness that left Elena's heart aching, he turned away, his steps rapid and determined as he retreated into the confines of his home. Elena remained standing there, a lone figure cloaked in a shroud of desolate yearning, her heart heavy with the weight of watching her son walk away once again. Yet, amidst the suffocating pain of their fractured connection, A fragile ember of hope began to flicker within her. The truth had been laid bare, raw, and unvarnished. Now, all she could do was cling to the belief that love, persistent and patient, might somehow breach the fortress of emotional barriers Ricardo had painstakingly constructed around his heart. The days that followed this painful confrontation were a maelstrom of emotions for Elena. Each morning, she approached the garden with a heart that seemed to swell with anxious anticipation, hoping, praying for a glimpse of Ricardo. The longing to repair their fractured relationship was almost a physical ache. Yet, despite her fervent hopes, he remained elusive, his absence creating a palpable void that seemed to hover like an unwelcome specter in the air. One afternoon, as Elena meticulously pruned the roses, a task she undertook with mechanical precision, Sophia approached with a tentative step, her face a canvas of sleepless nights and deep concern. "Elena?" Sophia said softly, her voice trembling with a mix of worry and compassion. "Ricardo has been deeply unsettled ever since he learned the truth." Elena's heart plummeted, a wave of anguish washing over her. "Is he consumed by anger?" she asked, her voice cracking with desperation and fear. Sophia shook her head, her own eyes reflecting a profound sadness. "No, it's not anger that grips him. It's a profound and disorienting confusion. He is questioning everything he once believed about himself and his place in the world. He has become a shadow of his former self, barely eating or sleeping. He spends long, isolating hours locked away in his study, surrounded by old photographs that seem to offer him no solace." Tears threatened to spill down Elena's cheeks once more. "I never intended to inflict this kind of pain on him," she murmured, her voice a whisper of regret. "I know," Sophia replied gently, her voice a balm of understanding. "And deep down, I believe Ricardo understands that too. But he is grappling with a storm of emotions and needs time to navigate through it." Unbeknownst to them, Ricardo stood silently in the dimly lit study, his gaze drifting between the two women through the window. His eyes flitted from Elena's sorrowful expression to Sophia's troubled face, his mind a whirlwind of memories, conflicting emotions, and unanswered questions. That night, as rest eluded her and the weight of her worries grew too heavy to bear, Elena found herself wandering through the quiet streets. Her steps, guided by a mixture of desperation and subconscious longing, led her to the imposing Montero mansion. She paused at the large, iron-wrought gate, her gaze fixed on the grandeur of the estate. The sight of the mansion, a symbol of everything that had come between them, seemed to magnify her sense of helplessness and yearning for reconciliation. Ricardo remained silent for what seemed like an eternity, his emotions roiling beneath the surface. Finally, without uttering another word, he turned abruptly and retreated into the house, leaving Elena standing there, her heart a tumultuous mix of deep-seated pain and a glimmer of newfound hope. As she made her way back to her modest room, Elena was struck by the realization that this moment marked merely the beginning of a lengthy and arduous journey toward reconciliation. Yet, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe that there was a genuine possibility of reconnecting with her son. As the vibrant hues of autumn gave way to the stark chill of winter, a biting cold seemed to infiltrate every crevice, seeping into the very marrow of those enduring its harsh grip. Despite the harsh weather, Elena maintained her daily routine in the garden, each movement now imbued with a heightened sense of purpose and hope. She was acutely aware that Ricardo occasionally observed her from the window of his study, though he remained silent and distant, never making any overtures. One particularly frigid morning, Elena approached the garden and was met with an unexpected sight. There, on the bench where she typically took her rest, sat a box. Her hands trembled with a mix of apprehension and excitement as she opened it. Inside was a new coat, crafted from warm, high-quality fabric that would offer significant protection against the winter's chill. There was no accompanying note, but Elena's heart told her exactly who the gift was from. With tears welling in her eyes, Elena slipped on the coat, feeling its comforting warmth envelop her. Just then, she noticed Sophia approaching with a gentle smile that spoke volumes. "It was Ricardo's idea," Sophia said softly, her eyes reflecting a mixture of warmth and sadness. "He couldn't bear the thought of you being cold." Elena's heart raced, touched by this indirect acknowledgement from Ricardo. It was the first sign that he recognized her as his mother, even if in a roundabout way. "He's struggling, Elena," Sophia continued, her voice laden with empathy. "Part of him deeply wants to reach out, to bridge the chasm that's grown between you. But another part is paralyzed by fear, afraid that if he allows you back into his life, he might once again face the possibility of losing you." Elena nodded solemnly, understanding the complexity of her son's internal battle. "I'll wait," she vowed with unwavering determination. "I'm prepared to wait as long as it takes." That afternoon, as Elena diligently worked in the garden, she sensed a presence behind her. When she turned, she found Ricardo standing a few meters away, his expression a careful mask of restrained emotions. Elena began to speak, "About the coat," but Ricardo cut her off. "I don't want you to get sick," he said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of tension. After a moment of hesitation, he continued, "I remember the necklace, the one you gave me when you left. I lost it years ago on a business trip. I had always—" Ricardo's voice faltered, and the words he struggled to articulate hung in the frigid air, as if waiting to bridge the gap between their past and the uncertain future. Elena stood silently, her heart aching with a mix of sorrow and cautious optimism, as the winter's cold enveloped them both, mirroring the emotional chill and the tentative warmth that now defined their fractured relationship. Spring's arrival ushered in a sense of renewal, not only within the garden but also within the very walls of the Montero mansion. The garden flourished with vibrant new growth, and the atmosphere seemed to shift subtly, hinting at the possibility of a softer, more hopeful future. Elena observed that Ricardo had begun spending more time at home, his presence now a frequent, albeit distant, observer from the terrace as she toiled among the blossoms. One crisp morning, as Elena worked diligently planting fresh flowers, Ricardo approached her with tentative, yet purposeful steps. There was a visible hesitation in his demeanor, but also a resolute determination. I'd like you to tell me about my childhood," he began, his voice a fragile blend of curiosity and nervousness. Elena's heart fluttered wildly in her chest at the request. With a trembling smile, she responded, "Of course, I'd be happy to. What would you like to know?" Ricardo took a seat on a nearby bench and gestured for Elena to join him. "Everything," he replied simply, his gaze earnest and imploring. For the next few hours, Elena poured out the stories of Ricardo's early years, each memory a thread in the tapestry of his past. She recounted the nights she would sing him to sleep, his first hesitant word, and the infectious laughter that would erupt when she tickled him. With every shared anecdote, Ricardo's demeanor appeared to soften, as though the layers of emotional fortification he had meticulously constructed over the years were gradually being peeled away. At one point, Ricardo's gaze grew distant, and he murmured, I remember a park. There was a swing. You used to push me, and it felt like I could touch the sky." Elena's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks. "The Oak Park," she said softly. "We went there every Sunday. It was our special place, our little escape from everything else." Ricardo looked at her, a storm of emotions reflected in his eyes. "Why didn't you fight harder for me?" he asked, his voice laden with an aching vulnerability. The question pierced Elena's heart like a dagger. Her voice quivered as she answered, "I fought with every ounce of strength I had, Ricardo, but poverty, mounting debts, and threats were overwhelming. I was young, frightened, and thought that giving you up for adoption was the only way to ensure your safety and a better future." Ricardo sat in contemplative silence, absorbing Elena's heartfelt words. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "All my life, I've carried a profound sense of emptiness, as though something vital was missing. Now I understand why." At that poignant moment, Sophia appeared on the terrace, her expression a mixture of surprise and cautious relief. Ricardo glanced at her, then turned back to Elena. "I need time to process all of this," he said, rising from the bench. But I want to try. I want to explore the possibility of understanding where I come from and who I am. Maybe, in time, we can find a way forward together. The evening at the opulent Montero estate was suffused with a palpable blend of anxiety and cautious optimism. Elena, adorned in her finest attire, felt an overwhelming sense of being out of place amidst the grandeur of the lavish dining room. Sophia, ever the embodiment of warmth and kindness, made earnest attempts to dispel the unease that permeated the room, while Ricardo's demeanor wavered between moments of heartfelt openness and guarded reserve. "Please, tell us more about yourself, Elena," Sophia urged gently as she poured a glass of rich, red wine. "Ricardo mentioned that you've worked in various roles before you became a gardener." Elena's hands quivered slightly as she grasped her silverware, the weight of her past evident in her trembling grip. "Yes, that's true," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been a waitress, a seamstress, a housekeeper, whatever it took to survive." Ricardo's gaze remained fixed on her, a question hanging heavily in the air, his eyes betraying a deep, unspoken pain. "All that? After?" His words trailed off, the mention of the adoption remaining unspoken but deeply felt. Elena's soft reply was filled with a mixture of sadness and strength. "Yes, it was a struggle, but the thought of you kept me going." An uncomfortable silence enveloped the table, only broken by the soft clinking of silverware against fine china. Without warning, Ricardo rose abruptly from his seat. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice strained, and quickly exited the room. Elena's heart sank, a wave of anxiety washing over her. Had she overstepped somehow? Sophia offered a comforting smile, her eyes reflecting empathy. "Give him a moment," she said gently. "This is difficult for him." Moments later, Ricardo re-entered the dining room, carrying a small, unassuming box. He sat down, his movements deliberate and filled with emotion, and opened it to reveal an old, weathered necklace. "I found it," he said, his voice trembling with raw emotion. "The necklace you gave me. I thought it was lost forever, but it was tucked away in an old box in the attic." Elena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the cherished family heirloom. "Oh, Ricardito," she whispered, the endearment slipping out in a moment of profound sentiment. Ricardo took the necklace with a reverent touch. "Throughout my life, I felt a mysterious connection to this necklace, though I never understood why. Now I do." He extended it toward her with a tender gesture. "I believe it belongs with you." Elena's tears began to flow freely, her heart overflowing with emotion. "No, my dear, I gave it to you so that a part of me would always be with you. It's yours to keep." Ricardo gazed at the necklace, then at Elena, and in his eyes, she saw a fleeting reflection of the boy he once was, mingled with the man he had become. "Perhaps," he suggested hesitantly, "we could share it as a symbol of both our past and, hopefully, our future." Sophia, who had been silently observing the heartfelt exchange with tears in her eyes, raised her glass in a quiet toast. "To the family," she murmured, "and to the bonds that neither time nor distance can sever." As their glasses clinked, Elena felt a profound shift within her, a spark of hope igniting where there had only been uncertainty. The evening progressed, enriched by stories, occasional laughter, and moments of restrained emotion. It marked the delicate beginning of a new chapter, an intricate bridge between the past and the future, constructed from the enduring love of a mother and a son's quest for his true self. In the days that followed, subtle but significant changes began to unfold. Elena continued her work in the garden, but now Ricardo often joined her, his attempts at gardening clumsy yet heartfelt as they engaged in conversations. Each interaction was a careful negotiation between old familiarity and new boundaries, both wary of missteps. One afternoon, as they planted new roses together, Ricardo broke the silence that had settled between them. "I've been reflecting deeply on my life and my identity," he confessed, his voice heavy with unspoken feelings. Elena listened attentively, her patience unwavering. "I've spent my life pursuing success, wealth, and power, Ricardo continued. I thought these would fill the void I felt inside, but now I realize I was mistaken. Elena's heart raced with anticipation. And what do you believe can truly fill that void? She asked gently. Ricardo looked at the roses they had just planted, his gaze introspective. Connection, love, the very things you gave me and that I failed to appreciate until now. At that moment, Sophia emerged from the house, holding an envelope with a concerned expression. Ricardo, this is from the board of directors, she said, handing him the envelope. Ricardo's expression turned grave as he read the letter. They want me to sell the company, he said finally. They claim my new policies are negatively impacting profits. Elena and Sophia exchanged worried glances. What will you do? Sophia inquired. Ricardo looked from Elena to Sophia, then back to the newly planted roses. I'm going to do what's right, he declared with newfound resolve. For the first time, I will act with integrity. Turning to Elena, his eyes shimmering with a fresh light, he said, Mom, I need your wisdom. You've lived a life of hardship and honesty. What would you do in my position? Elena's eyes welled with tears, moved not only by the question but by the trust it represented. I would follow my heart, she responded with heartfelt sincerity. Money comes and goes, but once integrity is lost, it's hard to regain. Ricardo nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. That's exactly what I needed to hear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the garden, the three of them remained in quiet contemplation, each absorbed in their thoughts. Elena felt she was witnessing a pivotal moment not just in Ricardo's life, but in her journey as well. The path to reconciliation was still long and challenging, but it now seemed to be paved with mutual understanding and a shared desire to heal. As the sky transformed into shades of orange and pink, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in decades, to embrace a deep and genuine hope for the future. The dawn arrived cloaked in a dreary, rain-soaked gray, mirroring the turmoil churning within Ricardo's life. From the small room she now occupied in the mansion, an accommodation Ricardo had generously offered after their recent dinner, Elena watched him with a mixture of concern and hope. Clad in his finest suit, Ricardo's demeanor betrayed the deep-seated tension he was feeling. Today was pivotal. It was the day he would confront the board of directors and face the repercussions of his recent choices. As he prepared to depart, Ricardo glanced up toward the window where Elena stood. Their eyes locked for a brief, poignant moment, and Elena glimpsed the frightened boy she had once cradled with comforting assurance. She offered him a warm, encouraging smile and a subtle gesture of support, her heart heavy with empathy. The hours dragged interminably. Elena attempted to distract herself by tending to the garden, but her thoughts remained anchored on Ricardo. Sophia joined her, the two women finding solace in each other's presence and in the shared task of nurturing the flowers. He has changed so profoundly, Sophia remarked quietly, her voice tinged with admiration. Since you arrived, it's as if he has awakened from a long slumber. Elena, her hands mechanically working the soil, nodded thoughtfully. I fear the cost may be too great, she admitted, her voice laden with concern. Sophia, surprising Elena with a gentle touch, took her hand. No matter the outcome, Ricardo possesses something far beyond material wealth, a family that loves him. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the sound of a car approaching. Ricardo had returned unexpectedly early. He stepped out of the vehicle with a slow, deliberate pace, his face a mask of inscrutable calm. Elena and Sophia hurried to meet him, their expressions filled with anxious anticipation. What happened? Sophia asked, her voice trembling with worry. Ricardo looked at both women, his eyes reflecting a strange, serene composure. It's over, he said simply. I sold the company. A stunned silence fell over them. Elena, her heart aching, finally spoke. Oh, Ricardito, I'm so sorry. To her astonishment, Ricardo's face lit up with a genuine smile, a rare and radiant expression of joy that Elena hadn't seen in years. Don't be sorry, Mom, he said, the term flowing from his lips with newfound ease. For the first time in my life, I feel truly free. Turning to Sophia, he took her hands with a gesture of deep remorse. Forgive me for placing work above you, above us, all these years. Tears glistened in Sophia's eyes as she embraced him tightly. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Ricardo then extended his arms, drawing Elena into the embrace as well. For a moment, the three of them stood united, enveloped in the gentle rain that seemed to cleanse and renew, symbolizing the washing away of past grievances and the nurturing of a fresh start. And what now? Sophia eventually asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Ricardo looked out at the garden, then at Elena and Sophia, his smile warm and hopeful. Now, he said with conviction, we start anew together. Elena felt a profound sense of joy, a feeling she hadn't experienced in decades. The journey towards reconciliation had taken an unexpected but promising turn, filling her with a renewed sense of hope for their shared future. In the days following the sale of the company, emotions ran high and changes came swiftly. News of Ricardo's surprising decision spread rapidly, leading to a flurry of activity at the Montero mansion, where journalists and former business associates clamored for details. One morning, while Elena was immersed in gardening, she heard raised voices emanating from the house. Cautiously, she approached and saw Ricardo engaged in a heated argument with a man in a sleek suit. You're out of your mind, Ricardo? The man shouted, his voice laden with disbelief. You've thrown away everything you've worked for. Ricardo, displaying an unexpected calm, replied, No, Carlos, I've done the right thing and that's what matters. I've reclaimed my life. Carlos, recognizing Elena's presence, cast a disdainful glance in her direction. And all of this because of this old woman, your so-called mother. Elena felt a chill at the insult. Stepping forward protectively, Ricardo positioned himself between Elena and Carlos. Be careful with your words, he warned, his voice edged with icy resolve. Carlos scoffed bitterly. You know what? You're not worth my time. Enjoy your new life of poverty. As Carlos departed, Ricardo turned to Elena, his eyes reflecting genuine concern. Are you all right, Mom? Elena nodded, moved by his protectiveness. I'm fine, but it's true. You've sacrificed a lot for me. Taking Elena's hands in his, Ricardo spoke earnestly. I haven't lost anything of true value. What I've gained is far more precious. A second chance with you, with Sophia, with life itself. At that moment, Sophia appeared in the garden, holding a letter with a worried expression. Ricardo, she said with a trembling voice, this is from the bank. They're calling in the mortgage on the house. Ricardo's face momentarily paled, but a strange calm settled over him. He looked at Elena, then at Sophia, and finally at the garden they had tended together. Maybe, he said slowly, it's time for a new beginning, a real one. Elena and Sophia exchanged puzzled glances. Ricardo continued, all my life, I've lived surrounded by luxuries that I didn't truly need. Perhaps it's time to learn to live more simply, more authentically. Sophia, after a moment of surprise, smiled warmly. You know, you're right. This house has never really felt like a home. Elena, feeling the need to contribute, spoke softly. I have some savings. It's not a lot, but it could help. Ricardo looked at her, his eyes brimming with emotion. Mom, you don't have to. I want to. Elena interrupted gently. We're family, aren't we? Ricardo nodded, tears shimmering in his eyes. Yes, we are. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden, the three of them sat together on the porch, discussing their future. It was clear that their journey would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, they felt they were embarking on the right path. A path that promised not material wealth but genuine happiness and the cherished family connection they had longed for. Autumn had arrived, casting a vibrant tapestry of gold and red over the trees. Elena, Ricardo, and Sophia stood in front of their new home on the city's outskirts. The house was modest compared to the grandeur of the Montero mansion, but its rustic charm and expansive garden filled Elena's heart with anticipation. "Are you sure about this, Ricardo?" Elena asked, her voice tinged with concern. Ricardo nodded, a serene smile gracing his face. "More sure than ever, Mom. This is our new beginning." Sophia, carrying a box of belongings, joined them with a warm smile. "It's perfect," she said, her affection for the house evident. As they unpacked and settled in, Elena couldn't help but notice the transformation in Ricardo. His face, once marred by tension and seriousness, now radiated a relaxed and peaceful demeanor. His eyes, previously reflecting only ambition, now sparkled with a newfound light. That evening, around a simple kitchen table, sharing a meal that Elena had lovingly prepared, Ricardo spoke up. "You know, all my life I thought success was measured by money and power, but now I see I was mistaken." Elena and Sophia looked at him with curiosity and encouragement. "True success," Ricardo continued, "is this: being here with the people I love, being true to myself." Sophia reached out and took his hand, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I'm so proud of you, Ricardo." Elena, her heart swelling with love, added softly, "Your father would be proud too." Ricardo looked at her in surprise. "My father? You've never talked about him." Elena took a deep breath, feeling it was time to reveal another piece of her past. "Your father was a good man, Ricardo. He loved us dearly, but life was tough. He passed away when you were very young, just before I had to give you up for adoption." The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. After a moment, Ricardo stood up and embraced Elena. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with gratitude. "Thank you for telling me this, for being here now." As they parted, Elena's gaze fell on the necklace around Ricardo's neck, the old one she had given him so many years ago. "You're wearing it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Ricardo touched the necklace with reverence. "Always. It's my connection to the past and my anchor in the present." That night, as Elena prepared to sleep in her new room, she felt a profound peace she hadn't known in decades. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but she finally had her family back. The future remained uncertain, but Elena knew that together, they could face any obstacle. With a contented smile on her lips, Elena closed her eyes, deeply grateful for the second chance that life had bestowed upon her. Spring had arrived, breathing new life into the garden Elena had lovingly nurtured in their new home. Ricardo, who had once been consumed by business, now spent his mornings with his mother, planting flowers and vegetables side by side. On this particular morning, as they worked together in the vegetable garden, Ricardo suddenly stopped, his face taking on a serious expression. "Mom," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "there's something I need to tell you." Elena straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. Her heart raced with anticipation and a hint of fear. Ricardo took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been reflecting on everything that's happened, on how my life has changed since I found you, and I've come to a realization." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I want to use the money I have left from the sale of the company to do something meaningful. I want to open a support center for single mothers and at-risk children." Elena's eyes welled up with tears. "Oh, Ricardito," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Ricardo nodded, his resolve firm. "I want to prevent other families from going through what we went through. I want to offer hope to those who feel they have no options." At that moment, Sophia appeared in the garden, holding an envelope. "Ricardo," Elena called, "this just arrived." Ricardo opened the envelope and read its contents. His face transformed from surprise to joy. "It's from the bank," he said, his voice trembling. "They've approved the loan for the center." Elena felt her heart swell with pride and love. This was her son, the man she had always believed he could become. "There's something else," Ricardo said, looking at Elena with shining eyes. "I want the center to bear your name, Mom. The Elena Montero Support Center." Elena's tears flowed freely now. She embraced Ricardo tightly, feeling as if all the years of separation and pain had melted away in that moment. Sophia joined the embrace, and for a while, the three of them stood united in their love and hope. When they finally parted, Ricardo took Elena's hands in his. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for showing me the true meaning of love and family." Elena looked around at the flourishing garden, the modest but love-filled house, her son, and her daughter-in-law. Her heart overflowed with gratitude and happiness. "No, my love," she replied, her voice full of emotion. "Thank you for giving me this second chance, for letting me be your mother again." As the sun shone warmly over them, Elena knew that this was not the end of their story but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter filled with love, forgiveness, and the promise of a brighter future for themselves and for the families they would help through the center. In that vibrant garden, a symbol of rebirth and hope, Elena and Ricardo's story found not an ending, but a new and beautiful beginning. "I would be very honored if you left me a like," Elena's voice gently invited. "And I invite you to watch the next story, which is amazing. Blessings." As we wrap up this heartfelt journey through Elena and Ricardo's story, we hope you found inspiration and insight in their transformative path. From confronting past wounds to embracing new beginnings, their journey has taught us the profound value of family, forgiveness, and the courage to change. We'd love to hear from you. What have you learned from this story? Is there one lesson or takeaway that you plan to bring into your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave your comment, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring content. Your support helps us continue to share meaningful stories and messages. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to connecting with you in the next video.